It seems that nowadays the horror game genre is one of the easiest places for games to slip into mediocrity. I mean, just looking at the Steam free indie game horror page can kinda give you an idea of how easy it is to make a pseudo horror game, put it out there for free without any real regard for design or the want to create an enjoyable experience. With all this in mind, however, horror game genres are also one of the ones where a really good game will go a long way for the studio as well as the developers behind it. Just think of the successes of games such as Outlast or Amnesia. So what is it that differentiates a good horror game from a bad horror game? And how can a game developer get from a paper concept to a full-fledged experience trying to achieve the best possible result? Well, first of all, there is obviously no simple formula for this. If there were, everyone would already be doing it. There are, however, in my opinion, multiple techniques and good practices to keep track of if you're working on a horror game, which should potentially and theoretically in the long run lead to a more enjoyable experience. As a quick disclaimer before I start talking about these, all of the opinions and ideas that I'm going to be talking about in this video are my opinions that are assembled from research online, my experience with the games, and from asking other people what they enjoy about horror games in particular. And if you happen to disagree with anything or have a different opinion, that's completely fine. I would like you to leave it down in the comments so we can discuss it after the video. Anyways, with that out of the way, grab your teddy bear, hide in the closet, and let's go. So to start us off, let's talk about something that is not that great when applied to horror games, and that is the overuse of cliches. We all know what that means. Cliché is a practice that has been simply used and overused so many times in different forms of media, be it movies, books, or video games, that it's become a trope of its own and is fairly easy to recognize when applied in the wrong way. How many times have you played a horror game, seen a door slowly creak open and already told yourself, oh, here we go, the jump scare is coming in 3, 2, 1, only to have a crow fly out at you for a quick cheap gimmick and only for you to move on afterwards. That is not to say that the use of all cliches are bad. In fact, cliches are what establishes the base of honestly any horror. It is incredibly difficult at this point to create something that's not been done yet, and so an interesting way to use these to your advantage is to use something that is established as a trope and then flip it on its head. Try to understand the reactions your player is likely to have to a situation and divert them. If your player is expecting a jump scare, maybe hold off on it and feed it to them a little bit later. There is in fact a very common technique which I'm sure you could have observed many times in games and especially in movies, called the fake jump scare or the fake out, where you will get the tension build up only for something happen that seems to alleviate the scare. As if it were no longer happen, the atmosphere briefly relaxes only for the scare to happen afterwards. It's a really simple way to divert from what your player expects and hence present the scare in a much more effective manner. But for any jump scare to actually mean anything, you need to understand the pacing and build anticipation correctly. Starting with the pacing, make it slow. It's never effective if a game puts all its cards on the table right off the bat. If you see the monster within the first 10 minutes of the game, it's just gonna become less and less scary as you go on. In my personal experience, some of the best horror games take hours and hours to just build anticipation with small noises and hints scattered through here and there to give you an idea of what the monster could perhaps look like, but never quite showing it. This also, however, leads to a payoff at the end. You should never build something up only for it to be completely dumbed down in the end, because the payoff is just not worth it. Make sure that whatever it is that you're building towards is adequately scary and is adequately rewarding for the player looking for that horror experience. An interesting technique to building anticipation is trying to be unpredictable, right? Use different focal points, such as sound or lighting, to divert the player's attention. If you remember in PT, the playable teaser for Silent Hills, back when that was still a thing, there are several sequences in which if you look upstairs, you can actually see the monster or the girl, whatever you want to call it, standing there. It's never the main focal point of the gameplay, that being the corridor with the swinging lamp, but if you actually look past and you notice it, it just becomes that much more creepy and it really makes your skin crawl. It's also playing on the psychology of the player, because it makes them think, man, how many smaller hints like this have I missed? Have I been watched the entire time? This furthermore leads into environmental storytelling. This should be immediately clear and explained to the player. What's the location, the setting, the time of the day, or the mood that the environment is trying to put on them. Make sure these aren't conflicting, because otherwise it can really quickly take the player out of the experience and ruin their immersion. The player needs to be able to identify with the location and understand how the main protagonist feels and why they feel that way. Linking it back to the cliches, we all know that bathrooms usually have bad stuff happen in them, so you can, as the game developer, already understand what type of mindset a player will have when entering a bathroom in your horror game, and then you can work from there. Talking more about the emotional connection, do remember your affordances, and that nothing breaks the immersion more than when the main character or the environment does not condone or answer to logic and rational reasoning. If your main character starts doing stupid stuff like exploring places that are really clearly going to not go well for them, it can, not always, but very often leads to a disconnect between your player and the main protagonist, which, if you watched my video on video game characters, will know is a big no-no. And finally, to the environment, make sure to use the soundtrack to your advantage. Some of the best horror games I know have, once again, some of the best soundtracks that accompany the mood as well as the pace and the tone of every single scene that they're applied to. It's often said that the audio makes for about a third of a game, the other thirds being gameplay and the visuals. However, in horror games, I would even push that percentage up a little bit, seeing as just how more effective a horror game can be with the proper use of a good soundtrack and small audio clues. This can also be used to highlight tension, you know, all the creaking, and you're walking through this decrepit and dilapidated barn, and you hear the wind gusts above the roof, and you hear some creaks in the floorboards on the upper floor. It's small things like this that eventually, when piled up, can greatly help you maintain the pace of a game and immerse the player in the world. Now finally, I want to just talk about a few more points which to avoid or to follow when developing a game that could help you make it an overall better experience. As already mentioned, focus on immersion. If the menu system or the saving system takes way too long or takes the player out of the experience, it's just not that great. Think to yourself, is there any way I can maybe incorporate the UI into the game, a la the health bar from Death Space, or the map system in Far Cry 2, even though that's not really a horror game. On the same note, avoid complicated puzzle design or enemy encounters that will take the player dozens of tries to complete. As soon as the pace stops on a dead puzzle or a really difficult section like this, the player immersion and scariness just goes down with every single death, and with every single minute the player is stuck solving a puzzle, which should not be the goal of a horror game. Don't make the progress for your player easy, but try to make it smooth if possible. On the same note, make mechanics and objectives clear. The player should understand what is required of them, because as soon as you just plop them into the middle of the forest and they start being chased by enemies and dying from random reasons, they will not want to play the game for much longer. This, however, also leads to not overusing mechanics. How annoying is it when in a video game you just keep running into jammed doors, and then you have to look around the area for a key and unlock the door to progress to another jammed door. It's kind of a play on the princess is always in another castle trope, but it's nevertheless frustrating when encountered and can ruin immersion really quickly. Continuing on what I said about affordance, don't make irrational decisions for the player. Don't put useful items on the floor and then not allow the player to pick them up. If your game does not contain a combat system and you're basing it on the player having to escape from the enemies, don't put useful tools or weapons like baseball bats or knives to their disposal, because it just wouldn't make sense why they wouldn't pick them up. And finally, and this doesn't just go for horror games but for all games in general, just be creative. Try thinking outside of the box. Not all enemies or monsters have to be hunched over with large teeth and moving in a really weird way. Sometimes it's the uncanniness of something that looks almost human that can make for the scariest atmosphere. Don't just use zombies for the sake of it because we've seen them a million times, and don't opt for cheap jump scares, as it will not help making your game more entertaining, but will probably lead to a loss of immersion and loss of player engagement, which is in the end something you definitely want to avoid. Anyways, that's it from me, guys. This was just a bunch of tips that could potentially help you make a better horror game, and it can also help you appreciate really good horror games if you're playing one, you can maybe start seeing some of these tropes or some of these tips being actually applied in real game development. If you guys enjoyed the video, maybe consider leaving a like, commenting, or subscribing. All of those would be very much appreciated. If you agreed or disagreed with anything I said, please make sure to put it down in the comments below. I would like to start an interesting discussion. I want to wish you all a bit of a rest off today, and I'm going to see you in whatever next video I make. Bye bye.